Welcome to Hundreds and Thousands, a poetry podcast showcasing the best of today's non-binary and trans poets. This week's wonderful poem is from Rose Butler. Once a fixture in the Bath and Bristol poetry scene, Rose has had some hand in running and photographing a huge variety of events in the area and performed at even more, including Bristol Harbour Festival, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival and many slams, and twice represented their university at UniSlam. They write about gender, relationships both romantic and platonic, the millennial Gen Z cusp experience and the concept of home. The Magpie Poet is hoping to re-enter the poetry scene once both their mental health and their finances stop being a bit shit. Very relatable, Rose. Let's have a listen to Picking Petals.
Do you remember the daisies you bought me? Met me at the bus station for our first date with daisies wrapped in tissue and tied with string. I pressed them between the pages of my favourite love story, in the hopes that one day we'd write our own. Do you remember the daffodils that we picked from the park on a lunchtime walk? We'd only met for coffee, but we have a tendency to get carried away. 3 hours later, we decided to walk home through the park. You picked me one shining golden bloom, and I picked one for you, and we both went home with bouquets. I was surprised how long they survived, in an old milk bottle on my windowsill. Do you remember the tulips you bought me? When we were walking home tipsy on a warm summer evening, you bought them from a street seller. 2 of every colour, wrapped in wax paper and tied with silver ribbon, we forgot them on a bench by the river. Do you remember the roses? Our first Valentine's together we bought into every cliché, candlelit dinner and chocolates and a teddy bear that said what we would learn to. Do you remember the peonies you got me when I got my dream job? You said they were as pretty and pink as me, and I blushed to prove you right. Do you remember the little cactus I bought you when you were having a bad day? We called it Phil, and when I spiked my finger you insisted on kissing it better. Do you remember the forget-me-nots on my birthday? Because you knew they were my favourites. Blue like your eyes and yellow like mine, I have always valued what they symbolise. Do you remember the flowers on the table? Frosted glass bowls of lilies and birds of paradise, glowing in softly burning candlelight, your face. Lit from within when I said yes. Do you remember the flowers in my bouquet? Brilliant blues to contrast a white dress, dusted with gold glitter that we still found weeks later. I had them preserved, you know. They're in a box above my wardrobe. Do you remember the daisies that I put in an old milk bottle on our first kitchen table? That was a good year for daisies. We tried not to tread on them as we carried boxes through our very first front door. We sat in the garden afterwards, ate tea from mismatched crockery and picked through petals. You love me not. Do you remember the garden we planted? Honeysuckle and climbing rose to hide the ugly boarded fence, chives and geraniums to remind you of home. I planted herbs, planned a 1,000,001 uses for them, all the meals I would cook for you. We planted hyacinths, and hydrangea we hoped one day would grow into a tree. We planted daffodils, to have gold come with the spring. Do you remember the way the flowers grew tangled? Crawling vines tied themselves in knots that I failed to undo. Pansies died for lack of light and petunias fought for space. The path became cluttered, with fallen leaves and blossoms no longer attached to stems. We pricked ourselves on the roses when we tried to cut them back, and eventually we were forced to surrender and tend our wounds. Do you remember how the flowers started to droop? I stopped buying bouquets for the table because the vase ended up smashed. The grass in the garden turned brown, and the flowers gave up their petals, drying purple blooms like bruises on the lawn. The flowers we had planted together slowly wilted. I tried to save them, but I couldn't. Water the flowers, please. They're dying.
Hundreds and Thousands is curated by Pascal Vine. Our theme is Reverie from Null Teal Records. Find our podcast on Instagram, YouTube, SoundCloud, Twitter, WordPress and Apple Podcasts. And of course, we're always looking for submissions. Thank you for listening.